let's have 15 minutes.
That's okay.
Može ovako? Moram nešto. Okay. Okay, we can start this panel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel titled "Women in Captivity." It's a pleasure and honor to be the chair of this panel and to welcome our lecturers and all of you who have joined us today. We will hear the three lectures. Our first lecturer is Professor Boris Cherny. Professor Boris Cherny is a professor of Russian at the University of Caen, France. He has been teaching Russian literature and civilization at the University of Caen since 2000. His research focuses mainly on Jewish civilization in Belarus and Ukraine. His latest book, The Shoah in Belarus, Historical Framework and Methodological Innovations, under the supervision of Boris Cherny and Claire Lefort, Honor Champion, 2025. Since 2021 and his appointment to the Institut Universitaire de France, he has been devoting to research exclusively the human and spatial reconstruction of the Brest Ghetto. On his initiative, the first Holocaust Studies Chair was created in France. He has presented the first results of his work on Brest at the Lessons and Legacies Conference in Prague 2023. At the ECHRI, Warsaw 2024, and he will participate at the 19th World Congress of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem 2025. Today his today topic is Jewish woman in Brest-Litovsk, an attempt to reconstruct daily life in the ghetto, 1941-1942. So, Professor Boris, you have your time.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I want to thank the organizer for the organization, which is wonderful, and to give me the opportunity to speak about Brest-Litovsk and the ghetto of Brest-Litovsk, because as far as I know, this topic of Brest-Litovsk, the ghetto, and the topic of Jewish women in the ghettos in the western part of Belarus remains uninvestigated to this day. So my intervention has a double objective. First, I very modestly wish to try to fill in 15 minutes a void by dedicating my presentation to the women in the Brest-Litovsk ghetto. So, second, I will try to show that it's possible to reconstruct the daily life of Jewish women in the Brest-Litovsk ghetto despite the absence of any female testimony, diary, or EGA document. To do this, I will let the little papers speak, and I will try to show that how a slow reading, that is to say an attentive reading of administrative documents, reveals some aspects of the daily life of the women in the Brest-Litovsk ghetto. On June 22, 1941, Hitler started Operation Barbarossa, marking the beginning of the invasion of the USSR. Brest was one of the first Soviet cities to be invaded. The inhabitants didn't have time to flee. From the beginning of the occupation of the city in July 1941, men, mostly Jewish, between the ages of 16 and 60, were exterminated by the SS with the support of the Wehrmacht. The number of these first victims fluctuates according to the sources between 4,000 and 10,000. We didn't have the names of these men. In December 1941, the rest of the Jewish population, about 17,000 people, were forced to settle in a ghetto located in the center of the city. On October 15 and 16, 1942, the Jewish population was totally exterminated. As I said at the very beginning, there is no diaries, diaries that allow us to reconstruct life in the ghetto. Only about 10 people survived the extermination. So when one studies ghettos, the Brest ghetto, you don't have to resolve the question, all people survive, but why people couldn't survive. They have no chance to survive. So, as we don't have any diaries, we have to use other documents, administrative documents. We must let archival documents speak for people, for women who were in the ghetto. Which document I'm talking about? Administrative documents can be divided into 3 categories: registration forms, in Polish protocol, letters to the social department of the city hall, and permits to leave the ghetto, as ways. What do we know about each of these documents and how we can use them? In mid-November 1941, the German authorities proceeded to the passportization of the population of Brest-Litovsk. This administrative measure concerned all Jewish persons aged at least 14 for boys and 16 years for girls at least. In all, we have 12,000 protocols. The name and dates of birth of children under the age of 14 or 16 were indicated on their father's or mother's protocol. The forms also included the names of people who didn't have protocols in their name, but who attested the identity of the person registered. In all, 12,000 protocols represent about 16,000 Jewish men, women, and children. The forms in Polish included the following section: first and last name, address, names of his father and mother for children, date and place of birth, profession, numbers of the identity card issued, nature of the document attesting to the identity, or the names of 2 persons vouching for the identity, the date the form was written, a photograph, a fingerprint. Each information of these 12,000 protocols has been digitized, which allows a global prosopographic analysis of the Jewish community. We made a search engine. Of the 16,000 people whose name appear on the protocol, about 11,000 are women and only 5,000 are men. The ratio is about 70 for women and 30 for men. This difference between 70 and 30 represents the number of Jewish men exterminated. The same percentage figure show the imbalance between men and women even more clearly. You see, here you can see the big discrepancy between men and women by ages. I don't have time. And this, for example, 48% of women between 21 and 30, and only 19 for men. If I now study the distribution of women, of Jewish women, according to the criterion of the language used to fill the form, I obtain the following results. So, the language spoken mainly by Jewish women in Brest was Polish. Mastery of this language was an asset for Jewish women. For them, Jewish women who spoke Polish could trade with non-Jewish inhabitants, avoid the anti-Jewish legislation. They could possibly pass for Polish women. To do this, they had to have an excellent Polish and not to be identifiable by an overly marked Jewish type. Another figure is important. the number of illiterate women here. Nearly a third of women couldn't read or write in Polish or in any other language. I don't comment on the result of the distribution of women by place of birth because I don't have time. However, I would like to say a few words about the social and occupational distribution. When filling out the passportizations form, more than 56% of women said they were dependent on their children's parents. If we add to this 56%, the number of women who couldn't work due to the application of Nazi legislation, and for example, it was forbidden to do business, to trade, to work in administration, schools, Jewish schools were closed, we arrive at the percentage of 70% of women who were without any resource to survive. This figure makes it possible to establish the prosopography of Jewish women, Jewish population of Brest. These figures allow us to establish the typical portrait of the Jewish inhabitant in Brest in 1941-1942. She was a woman between 20 and 50 years old, without a profession and speaking mostly in Polish, or illiterate. Many of them were without a husband. This typical portrait allows us to understand why the number of survivors of the Brest Ghetto was very small. These women were not in position to put up physical resistance or to organize it. Protocols here can also be read in another way. I mean, it's possible to abandon the wide shot of quantitative analysis and opt for a narrow angle of view in order to focus on little sparks of life and get closer to the daily life of Jewish women in Brest. One of the most moving cases is that of Elena Slutská. This is her protocol. If we read the protocol of Elena Slutská carefully, we see that a woman, Anastasia Lapitska, here is his name, Anastasia Lapitska, Anastasia Lapitska vouched for Elena's identity. Anastasia Lapitska's father was called Ivan, so he was Polish. So his daughter Anastasia was also Polish. This unique document tells us that during the registration of the Jewish population, a Polish woman decided to tie her destiny to that of a Jewish woman, Elena Lapitska. There is no such a case for a man. Other documents letters sent by Jewish women to the city hall tell us the full extent of the distress in which they were after the arrest in June of their husbands and son, and because of the destruction of homes following the fighting that took place at the very beginning of the war on June 21. These letters written in Polish are temporal windows reproducing the present in all its visibility and immediacy. I found a few letters similar to those of Varanowska-Chaya, about 10 letters, written by women living at the 28th Sienkiewicz Street. These women wrote to the city hall to contest the amount of the rent, which they found very high. These letters have other similarities. These women consider themselves old. They are between 45 and 55 years old. They say they are exhausted and sick. Their husband or son disappeared in July 1941. In each of the letters, the overwhelming materiality of daily life relegates the death of the husband or the son to the rank of a simple detail among other. Lack of money, apartment in very bad state, water leaks, and toy rents. Taking this data into account makes it possible to establish that it was exhausted women, unable to work and oppressed by material worries, who in December 1941 were obliged to settle into the Brest Ghetto. They didn't represent the anti-Jewish population of the ghetto, but constituted a significant part of it. The request addressed to the city hall expressed the dereliction of this woman after the invasion of Brest in June 1941. However, these documents also attest a kind of resistance and opposition. These women didn't want to pay a tax that they considered unfair. They are driven by a spirit of protest in the literal sense of the word. These women are contesting the price of the rent imposed on them and collectively denouncing the insanity state of their housing. These women, therefore, work together to carry out the process and to obtain together the exemption of their rent. There is a real spirit of mutual aid between them. These letters are certainly among the last received by the social service to the city hall in October 1941. It ceased to provide material help to the Jewish population. The creation of the ghetto in December 1941 established a state of segregation, the limitation and then prohibition of movement outside the ghetto. Application for passes. I don't have to analyze all the census of the application for passes, but it's very, very interesting. And application for passes and other work certificates are the light witness to the existence of the women of the Brest ghetto. These documents can be classified into 4 categories. I'm sorry, it's too early. Oh, it's too early. First, application for passes and certificates from construction companies. Application for passes, work certificates from employees of the German civil or military administration. Requests from Polish civilians for personal reasons. They wanted a pass for a Jewish woman who worked in the home. And fourth document, fourth category, requests for passes from Jewish doctors and craftsmen. These 4 cases make it possible to establish a spectrum, a whole spectrum of relation between the women in the ghetto and the Aryan side. It goes from exploitation, sexual exploitation, exploitation, to a form of compassion. Ghetto conclusion. Up. At the beginning of my presentation, I said that my goal was to make the little papers speak. I hope I succeeded in showing that these papers had a female voice. And this is for a simple reason. The Jewish population of Brest was mostly composed of women. The echo of these voices reaches us until April 1942. From that date, the ghetto became a closed ghetto, and Jewish men and women, men with women, like on this picture, women with men, were given to work for big construction sites. The indifferentiation of the sexes and genders marked a step toward the negation of the anti-Jewish population. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cherny. It was just on time. 15 minutes, perfect. Thank you very much. Our next lecturer is Eileen Groth Lyon. Eileen Groth Lyon received her PhD from the University of Cambridge. She is a professor of history at the State University of New York at Fredonia, where she teaches courses in the history of the Holocaust, the history of Christianity, and the modern European and British history. Dr. Lyon is the author of several articles and books related to religion and politics. Her most recent publications are An Unbendable Strength in Our Rosary, Religious Life in the Giessen concentration camp, in Church History and Religious Culture 2021, and Christian Feminism and Social Commitment, Margaret Schlachter and the Sisters of Social Service, in Kirchliche Zeitgeschichte or Contemporary Church History 2023. In addition to teaching and writing, Dr. Lyon works on an identity recovery project at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. She is a contributor to I'll read just the English because it is in Polish, which I don't know. Restoring the identities of those deported to and imprisoned in Caen, Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, 2023. She was recognized with an if not for those 10, award for special contribution to promoting the memory of Auschwitz in July 2024. Today, Dr. Lyon will speak about subject of women in Jehovah's Witness, which is titled Life Lived in Honor of Jehovah's Witnesses at Ravensbrück. So, Professor Dr. Lyon.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to speak about something perhaps a little different. So disparagingly considered a sect, Jehovah's Witnesses were among the first victims of Nazi persecution. Aside from the Jews, they were proportionally the most ruthlessly persecuted of all religious groups in terms of the percentage of their members falling victim to the Nazis. Indeed, their legal difficulties in Germany and elsewhere predated the Nazi period, but intensified after 1933, when the group was officially banned. Witnesses gained a reputation for steadfastness in their religious beliefs, moral behavior, and lack of compliance with the Nazi regime. Magdalena Kossaro-Reuter declared, "Staying faithful to Jehovah was more important than staying alive at any cost." Hence, many witnesses readily accepted martyrdom to demonstrate their devotion to God, rather than any small compromise with what they perceived to be the forces of Satan. Their faith taught them to remain confident in the face of their Nazi persecutors, for God would be by their side and their devotion would be rewarded with a place in his kingdom. This paper examines the experiences of female witnesses at Ravensbrück and the ways in which their faith proved integral to survival, and explores their unique situation in the camps. The movement's origins lie in the International Association of Bible Students, founded in the United States by Charles Taze Russell in the late 19th century. The group's beliefs originated in the Adventist tradition with a focus on the imminent establishment of the kingdom of God. They rejected some traditional Christian beliefs, such as the doctrine of the Trinity and the divinity of Jesus. Joseph Franklin Rutherford, who succeeded Russell as leader of the group, instituted several theological and organizational changes. Among these was the adoption of the name Jehovah's Witnesses in 1931 to distinguish the group from some of the other societies that retained Bible students as part of their official name, but ended their affiliation with the International Association of Bible Students. German documents from the Nazi period continued to use the term Bibelforscher, or Bible student, because it remained the legal name of the group in Germany. The new name marked a break with the complicated legacy of the past. From its very inception, the group held a strong missionary commitment, which meant that their particular understandings of Scripture and the practical import of these views for interacting with the world spread quickly to many other countries. Their heavy focus on Old Testament texts and conception of themselves as spiritual Jews, or Jews circumcised of the heart instead of the flesh, added to the antipathy of the Nazis toward the group. Despite a ban on the group in Germany, they continued their missionary efforts, producing and distributing literature, organizing Bible study meetings, and remaining unwilling to fulfill what the Nazis considered civic responsibilities. These civic responsibilities included giving the Nazi salute, participating in elections, and ensuring that their children were enrolled in the Hitler Youth or League of German Girls. Unlike other resistors who defied the Nazis, Jehovah's Witnesses did not conceive of their resistance as political. Their focus was on strict adherence to the scriptures, which they believed commanded nonviolence, charity, and political neutrality. They respected state authority only insofar as it did not contradict with what they understood to be divine commands. Their radical political neutrality, a theological rather than political concept, was rejected by the Nazis. The inability to incorporate the group into the Volksgemeinschaft made them especially threatening to the regime. The Nazis took measures almost immediately to force compliance. Witnesses were harassed in various ways, including loss of income, social ostracization, interrogations, and ultimately the loss of their children and imprisonment. Witness children were removed from their families on the grounds that their parents were endangering a child's welfare through teaching of aberrant religious and political ideas, and placed in the care of reliable German families or in juvenile detention institutions. Adult witnesses were initially held in local prisons where they were often brutally treated. Christina Frisch, a Jewish woman from Łódź, remarked on a large number of Bible students in Stadelheim prison who were beaten, some dying as a result. The extent of the persecution of witnesses is difficult to determine, and there's a whole controversy about the numbers. But it seems there were about 25,000 active members in Germany and 10,000 in other countries that would come under occupation between 1933 and 1945. The most significant thing about the numbers from my perspective is a comment made by Johannes Robel that he buries in a footnote, where he gives the figures for the number of active witnesses in Germany in 1933 and 1936. And these figures suggest that half of the group's members chose to end their affiliation or to continue practicing their faith clandestinely following the 1933 ban. Hence, it is likely that those arrested and deported to the camps, or this, I would argue this is the case, were among the most rigorous adherents to the group's religious and moral teachings. This may go some way toward explaining their camp behavior. Jehovah's Witnesses are sometimes referred to as, quote, voluntary prisoners, because unlike the Jews and most other groups of prisoners, it was believed that they could regain their freedom by signing a declaration renouncing their affiliation to the group. However, such a document also required informing the authorities of any visits from witnesses, promptly surrendering any witness literature to them, and fully complying with whatever the state required. And you see an example of this declaration. It was this additional requirement of betraying other believers that made it impossible for faithful witnesses to sign the declaration. Often this requirement was not known to family members outside the camps who were urging them to sign. Sophie Stippel, a prisoner of several camps, including Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, maintained that if her husband had known the full nature of the commitments he was urging her to undertake, he would have understood her refusal. Ultimately, Stippel's husband initiated divorce proceedings, and the papers were served to her in Auschwitz. Margaret Buber-Neumann, a German communist, served as a functionary prisoner in Ravensbrück. She noted the pile of forms in the SS office and acknowledged that only a few of the, quote, weaker sisters signed. They were very much the exception. At one point, she pleaded with one of the elderly witnesses to sign, telling her that promises made under duress have no moral significance and no binding value, and outside you could carry on with your work. The woman replied unhesitatingly, "We could not reconcile that with our consciences. To sign the SS form would be to pact with the devil." Interestingly, a surviving text written by a witness on a scrap of a German newspaper included lines from Ecclesiastes, which said, "It is better not to make a vow than to make a vow and not keep it." The perception that the Jehovah's Witnesses were in a unique position was reinforced by the special marking they were given in the camp. After the camp symbols were regularized in 1938, the witnesses wore a purple triangle on their camp clothing, the only non-Jewish religious group to be identified in such a manner. Initially, female witnesses were deported from local prisons to Moringen and then to the Lichtenberg concentration camp. Lichtenberg was one of the first to be operated by the SS, but it soon became seriously overcrowded. In 1939, the first transport of prisoners was brought from Lichtenberg to Ravensbrück. Nearly all of the women in the initial transport to the Ravensbrück camp were German, and a high proportion of them were Jehovah's Witnesses. Max Kogel, the first commandant, the first commandant of Ravensbrück, was brought from Lichtenberg. Despite various brutal measures, he had been unable to break the resolve of the Jehovah's Witnesses there and was again faced with their intransigence. Almost immediately, a few of the witnesses refused to take part in decorating to celebrate Hitler's birthday. Kogel responded with brutal disciplinary measures, but these seemed not to deter future protests. In December 1939, he was met with the mass refusal of some 400 witnesses to sew small bags for the soldiers. Kogel forced them to stand in the cold for hours without coats before imprisoning them in dark cells in the camp bunker on starvation rations. Elsie Unterdorfer and Elfriede Lohr recalled that their response was to give themselves courage as they taught each other psalms. This protest and subsequent punishment of Jehovah's Witnesses was ongoing for about 3 weeks when Heinrich Himmler made his first visit to the camp in early January 1940. Kogel lobbied him to permit Prügelstrafe beatings as authorized in the men's camp. As he considered the matter, Himmler visited the women in the bunker and found them starving and freezing, yet huddled together in prayer. The women were absolutely steadfast in their refusal to renounce their faith. In response to Himmler's taunting that God had abandoned them, one of them replied, quote, "God will save us, and if he does not, we will not serve you." Himmler approved the Prügelstrafe beatings, and they were almost immediately extended to other categories of prisoners and became a disciplinary staple of the camp. Despite their deprivations, a high level of solidarity and mutual assistance characterized the group. The mark of the purple triangle allowed newcomers to quickly identify their co-religionists and be supported both spiritually and materially from the moment of their arrival. They were placed together in Block 3 and later 17. This was designed to lessen the opportunities for witnesses to spread their faith to other prisoners, but it greatly strengthened their resolve. I'm going to skip this part here. Those with favorable work assignments did everything possible to extend their good fortune to the whole group. Marianne Korn was among those who endured the savage punishment from December 1939 to January 1940, following the collective refusal to do war-related work. After the conclusion of the punishment and period of hard labor, she was assigned as secretary to Johanna Langefeld, and she helped to get rid of a brutal capo and replacement with somebody who they felt would be more supportive of them. And that was Boiber Neumann. And the women acquired Bibles and witness literature. And when she discovered that they had hid these illegal materials all over the place, she encouraged them to hide them in the block where they would be less likely to be discovered. And so after this acceptance, Bible study, prayer, discussion, hymn singing took place very openly in the block. A system was put in place to alert the women to the impending arrival of the German guards. And when they moved to Block 17, a special place was created between the ceiling and the roof to house their Bibles and other forbidden literature. The opportunity for communal prayer and study brought much strength and encouragement. One of the most difficult experiences in the camp could be the lengthy roll calls in freezing temperatures. Magdalena Kossera-Ruder recalled that when the SS guards were out of earshot, all would repeat a text from mouth to mouth and thus center our minds on God's word. She asserted that this spiritual aid helped us to endure. Those witnesses who could not speak German also found ready fellowship. Irina Otrempska, a Polish witness, recalled a group of 25 who shared their food and supported each other spiritually. Even with the strong spiritual and social support, individual consciences seemed to draw varying conclusions as to what constituted work in support of the war. Boiber Neumann recalled 3 factions: the extremists, the wavering middle, and the moderates. She felt that the extreme faction continued to promote forms of passive resistance to any work that could be construed as war-related in a manner that provoked the SS. In the summer of 1940, Kogel deliberately assigned the women to work that he knew they would refuse to undertake. He directed them to build air raid shelters for the commandant and others in the SS garrison. When they refused, he had all the witnesses flogged. It was a pitiful scene, as many of the women were elderly and some did not survive. This proved one of several brutal collective punishments of the witnesses that were long remembered by prisoners of many backgrounds. Neumann asserted that the extremist faction, she said, quote, hungered and thirsted for martyrdom. There are many examples of their non-compliance followed by fierce retribution. For example, 2 witnesses were executed for refusing to darn socks for Wehrmacht soldiers. Some prisoners remarked with astonishment and admiration on the prayerful and heroic demeanor of the witnesses. Nanda Herbermann, a German Catholic functionary prisoner, observed that the witnesses, quote, truly understood how to love and to suffer. Others chalked it up to what they termed, quote, fanaticism. Kogel was unsuccessful in breaking the will of these women. Female witnesses only grew stronger in their defiance. They refused to attend camp roll calls, believing that they could stand before God alone and not before earthly powers. The women were doused with water in freezing temperatures, denied bedding and food, beaten and imprisoned in the bunker. Kogel was unrelenting in these savage punishments of the witnesses until he departed the camp in 1942 to take up the command of Majdanek. When Fritz Sören took command of the camp in mid-1942, a different approach was taken to the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were given positions of trust, such as working in SS households, caring for children, cleaning, cooking, and the like. Neumann remarked, quote, their sense of duty and their feeling of responsibility were unshakable. They were honest, industrious, and obedient. In short, they were the ideal slaves for the SS. The more moderate witnesses took up these favorable work assignments and were also given the privilege of freely moving in and out of the camp. While this work for the SS may be interpreted as involving some degree of compromise and ambiguity, the witnesses would likely have seen it as a return to their traditional homemaking endeavors rather than a contribution to the war effort. It should be noted that there is no suggestion that the witnesses perpetrated violence against or deliberately disadvantaged other prisoners. This would have been an unacceptable level of compromise. In the eyes of other prisoners who entered the camp after Sören took control, the witnesses were the best treated prisoners. They showed no interest in escaping, for this would have been, in the words of Neumann, rejecting the crown of martyrdom. They used this freedom to make contact with other witnesses outside of the camp and to gain access to their Bible literature. A crucial refuge for the witnesses was Himmler's doctor and massage therapist, Felix Kirsten, who owned an estate near the camp. He convinced Himmler to give him some prisoners to help with his home and farm, resulting in a couple of dozen witnesses working for him. This became a place of refuge where translations and articles were prepared. In the end, the favorable work assignments and support of their co-religionists meant that the witnesses had a high survival rate. They'd faced the ultimate test and survived, something they attributed to God's guiding hand and a sign of his favor. For some, the path ahead was no smoother. Those who returned to eastern parts of Germany, Poland, and the like found a political situation which was hardly favorable to their faith. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Our next is Michel Damm. Michel Damm pursued from 2017 to 2023 a state examination degree in secondary school teaching with mathematics and German as her subjects at the University of Giessen. Following her graduation in 2023, she started a master's degree in German, specializing in comparative literature and Holocaust literature. Since 2024, she has been working as a research assistant at the Arbeitsstelle Holocaust Literatur. Her previous publications and presentations have dealt with the following topics: women in the National Socialist era, local history of the National Socialist era, biographies of women in the NS, and anti-Gypsyism. Today, Michel Damm will speak about on the subject of titled Researching Forced Labor in the Ziegenhain women's prison, a preliminary report. So, Michelle, please.
Yes, thank you for your introduction and thank you for everyone who is organizing. I want to welcome all of you to my presentation on forced labor on the Ziegenhain Women's Prison. As the title already suggests, I'm going to present some first research results that I have gathered over the past 7 months. I began researching the Ziegenhain Women's Prison during an internship at the Documentation and Information Center Stadt Allendorf, and after this 10-week internship, I continued researching in my free time up until now. Today I want to present you one of my 3 research focus areas. We're going to explore more about the life in Ziegenhain, the living conditions, and most importantly, what was the forced labor like for the imprisoned women in Ziegenhain. As there's no direct translation for the German word Zuchthaus, I will use the German term in some parts of the presentation. A Zuchthaus was a special kind of prison, such as the one in Ziegenhain, which was originally intended to re-educate the imprisoned people. The Nazis, of course, used this as a euphemism, as we will see throughout the presentation. Yes, I would like to start with the legal system in the National Socialist era to understand who ended up in a so-called Zuchthaus. In the 1930s Criminal Code, there were especially 2 important paragraphs, 85 and 86. These paragraphs covered 4 different forms of imprisonment, as all of these could be translated as prison in English. I'll use the German terms instead. The different forms of imprisonment were the Zuchthaus, Gefängnis, Haft, and Festungshaft. The so-called Zuchthaus was the harshest form of imprisonment, the Festungshaft the mildest. Of course, this is not a modern-day rating, but rather shows the hierarchy during the Nazi era. For example, in the 2 mentioned paragraphs of the Criminal Code, the imprisonment in a Zuchthaus was the highest possible penalty. From 1939 onwards, a new law came into effect called the Kriegssonderrechtsstrafrechtsverordnung, or in English, like Ordinance Concerning Special Criminal Law in Wartime with respect to special operations. One of the new laws included the so-called Wehrkraftzersetzung, meaning decomposition and undermining the military morale. If someone was punished for this offense, the penalty had to be at least 5 years Zuchthaus. In comparison to prisons, living conditions in so-called Zuchthäusern were worse. Prisoners had to physically demanding forced labor all day long, lived in overcrowded accommodations, and did not have enough food. As you can see already, the prisons in Zuchthäuser of the Third Reich didn't serve as places to better or reform the prisoners, but to exploit them. The Nazis used terms like Zuchthaus as euphemisms to hide the exploitation that took place in these institutions. Now we'll have a closer look on Ziegenhain, the living conditions and medical care. The women's prison was located in the castle of Ziegenhain. In the picture, the women's prison is marked with a red circle. This building was used as a Zuchthaus for women since 1882. Here you can see the entire castle and its buildings. The women's prison is on the bottom right, marked in red. On the top left, you can see a lot of red buildings, which were the men's prison. The women's prison had a yard for taking walks, and the prisoners could go to a church, which was in the inner courtyard of the castle. The women in Ziegenhain were primarily persecuted for political reasons, so they were mainly members of the communist or the social democratic parties and organizations. The living conditions in Ziegenhain were catastrophic. There were neither enough clothes nor bedding, so the imprisoned women couldn't change either of both regularly. They had problems with bed bugs and lice and didn't receive enough food, which resulted in weight loss for a lot of the women. Furthermore, the women's prison was overcrowded at all times. It had a capacity of 120 women. In autumn 1944, however, there were more than 800 inmates, almost 7 times its capacity. The imprisoned women came from different countries, including the German Reich, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Greece, Italy, and Czechia. The origins of the women were important because of the racist Nazi ideology. According to the National Socialist ideology, people from Nordic countries were considered more valuable than those from more Eastern countries. Inmates who came from Eastern Europe or who were Jewish were treated worse than those from Western Europe. The mentioned aspects of the living conditions can be found in the files to Ziegenhain. In a letter from 1937, written by the administration of the women's prison, it is mentioned that there are bed bugs in the dormitories due to the warm weather. Another letter from 1944 no, states that the transported prisoners were completely lice infested. There's a quite interesting aspect regarding this letter. It was written by the SS and leader of the police in Kassel and was addressed to the district president. So even the SS were aware of the conditions in which the women were living, having seen the lice-infested women firsthand. Probably this note wasn't made out of concern or care for the women's welfare. On the contrary, the Nazis tried to hide the poor living conditions and bad health conditions the women were exposed to, so it is reasonable to assume that they didn't want the civilian population to see the women as lice-infested as they have been. In this document, written in 1940, it is mentioned that approximately 70 to 80% of the imprisoned women lost 5 to 8 kilograms. It is also stated that the women were still able to work, but could probably have worked more if they had more food to eat. It should be noted that the Nazis tried to give the prisoners as little food rations as possible, as can be seen by looking into the spendings for food per capita. Most of the time, the Nazis spent around 40 Reichspfennig, so 0.4 Reichsmark, per capita per day. According to the Statistical Office of the Reich, in 1940, 1 kilogram of bread could be purchased for 40 Reichspfennig. The insufficient food supply and the bad health conditions of the inmates could be countered by relatively good medical care available in Ziegenhain. Located between Kassel and Marburg, Ziegenhain has a good infrastructure and transport connections to Marburg, where a hospital can be found. In addition, Ziegenhain had its own medical care. On the left, you can see a patient's room in Ziegenhain, and on the right is a doctor's room. Due to the medical care in Ziegenhain, women had the possibility to be put on sick leave by the doctor in Ziegenhain, giving them an opportunity to rest. Furthermore, there were referrals from the doctor to the hospital in Marburg, so the women could be treated there. Thanks to the doctor in Ziegenhain and the transport links to Marburg, the women in Ziegenhain received better medical care than prisoners in other establishments. Now we'll have a closer look on forced labor in Ziegenhain, especially the employment figures, fields of forced labor, working conditions, and effects. In the shown chart, I merged all occupancy and employment numbers I have found in the files about Ziegenhain. Clearly, in the beginning of 1936, there were still women without employment, as can be seen from the green bars. Since 1939, there are nearly no women without an employment. Everyone had to work in different fields of forced labor. In 1944, for example, some women were unemployed, but these women were ill and unable to work because of their health situation, so regularly they did have an employment. Sadly, the numbers are missing for some years, but we can assume that this is an ongoing trend as the Nazis forced women to work. You can also see that there has been increasing numbers of prisoners from 43 to 44, reaching a peak in autumn 44 with around 800 imprisoned women. The increase in prisoners is based on legislation. Since 1944, Zuchthaus has been a penalty for treasonous relations, disclosure of state secrets, treason against the people by spreading lies, and aiding the enemy. From 1943 onwards, there were more arrests due to the so-called Wehrkraftzersetzung, which was also punished with Zuchthaus. The employment figures for 1936 and 1944 show a noticeable difference. While 1/4 of the imprisoned women weren't working in 1936, so every 4th woman, in 1944 it was only 7% of the imprisoned women, so every 14th woman. The 18 women who weren't working in 1944 were, as I said, on sick leave. As we can see, with increasing years of the war, there are less women without a work. The women had to work in a variety of fields of forced labor. This list shows the areas of forced labor within own companies in 1944. The tailoring and heating fields are marked because women worked in those fields. It is not surprising to see that women had to work as tailors, as it was considered a typically feminine occupation. However, there were more fields of forced labor, only those owned by prison companies are listed here. The women were also required to work for civilian companies, as can be seen here. The imprisoned women produced items such as tents or gloves for the Wehrmacht. As this work was carried out for the Wehrmacht, it was marked with the highest urgency level and had to be kept secret. Some prisoners also worked on producing grenades and armaments. I quote what can be read here. 41 German male and 32 German female prisoners worked directly on grenade and armament production. It is a matter of highest urgency level to be kept secret. The letter continues. The DAG Allendorf has requested the Attorney General in Kassel to assign approximately 200 additional female prisoners to ammunition production with the highest level of urgency. Those working fields may seem surprising because the work isn't typically female, but there are mainly two reasons for these circumstances. On the one hand, it is due to the cause of the war. As Nicholas Waxman stated, gender segregation is eliminated during wartime, leading to imprisoned women working in male-dominated fields such as armament companies. On the other hand, it wasn't unusual for women to work in armament companies in the Allendorf era. At this time, Allendorf was a small village with about 1,500 inhabitants. Right next to the village were two big armament companies, the Dynamit Nobel AG, in short DAG, and the Westfälisch-Anhaltische Sprengstoff AG, short for WASAG. They built around 650 production and processing buildings in an area of about 1,000 hectares. During the years of the Second World War, these two companies produced more than 125,000 tons of TNT and more than 30,000 tons of other explosives. Many prisoners were forced to work in the production, including some imprisoned women from Ziegenhain. Working there was very dangerous for the women because of the explosives. It was also hazardous to their health. They did not have enough protective clothing, so the women faced injuries, hand discolorations, and diseases. All of the above highlights the exploitation of the prisoners. Waxman states that the primary aim was to ensure the prisoners' total commitment. One can see the increasing focus on work in the files to Ziegenhain. In this letter from 1938, it is stated that, I quote, "Sundays and those days that are considered public holidays at the place of imprisonment are work-free for prisoners." The way the Nazis handled the forced labor changed over time, as can be seen in a letter from 1944. In this document, it is declared that working hours should be at least 12 hours per day. Furthermore, prisoners had to work for at least the same amount of time as civilian workers in the company. Consequently, imprisoned women had to work on Sundays too, as some companies did not have work-free days. For example, this applied to the DAG and WASAG, but also to agricultural holdings. The effects of forced labor can be seen by looking at the files of the imprisoned women, like Helene Huskes. She was arrested in 1941 on charges of high treason for working with the legal underground organizations of the banned Communist Party, as stated by two witnesses. There's little information in her file about her first 1.5 years in Ziegenhain. In 1943, there are medical notes stating that Helene Huskes had lost a lot of weight and now weighed only 49 kilograms despite being 153 centimeters tall. The doctor also states that her life is not in danger, but that she will be not able to work full-time. Furthermore, it is written that her psychological health is poor as she is suffering emotionally. Still, she worked diligently. Sadly, the file does not specify what kind of work Helene Huskes had to do, but one can see clearly that she suffered from the living and working conditions in Ziegenhain, even though Ziegenhain had a relatively good medical care. However, the descriptions of Helene Huskes clearly show that the women deteriorated physically and mentally within a short period of time due to the adverse conditions and the constant forced labor they were made to perform daily. The case of Helene Huskes also demonstrates the arbitrariness of the National Socialist legal system. Even though she denied the charges against her, it only took 2 statements of witnesses to arrest her. Although there was one statement denying her activities in underground organizations, she was still punished with a multi-year sentence. Her release from Ziegenhain again shows this arbitrariness. Despite the Women's Prison Administration certifying that she could be released according to her sentence, she was taken into so-called Schutzhaft, or protective custody, and was deported to Ravensbrück women's concentration camp. I will now summary the forced labor in the women's prison in Ziegenhain. As can be seen today, the women lived in catastrophic conditions. They didn't have enough food, clothing, or bedding, and had to deal with bedbugs and lice. The prison was overcrowded throughout all those years, especially in 1944. The women had to work 12-hour days in different forms and fields of forced labor, even in so-called manly occupations and in companies with very dangerous working environments. there are still remaining questions that need to be answered through further research. For example, it needs to be researched whether there are any other special working fields in Ziegenhain, and if so, which ones. Additionally, more files on the women imprisoned and the female security staff must be examined to see if there's more information. Some initial answers to some questions and examinations of certain aspects are provided in a reader to be published next year, which will include essays by the Hessian State Archives Marburg, the Documentation and Information Center Stadt Allendorf, another researcher, and myself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, when we have finished our these three presentations, three really interesting topics, and also presentations, I look forward for someone good discussion. And I think that this will bring up a lot of questions. So now it's time for the audience to give the comments and questions if they want. So.
Hello? Yes. All right. Thank you all very much. This was a very interesting session. I have a question for Michelle and also Eileen. Michelle, you mentioned the medical care, and of course I have to ask, because it's part of my research, who was giving the medical care? Were there patients? Were there prisoners who were providing medical care? So I wonder if you could just elaborate more on that. And if I can just ask my second question, or would you like me to go one by one? Okay. Eileen, what you said about Fritz Surin was very interesting. And I wonder if the Jehovah's Witnesses who were given this special treatment had any role in uncovering Mitvärde, for instance. Were they aware? Did they have any insight because of their positions and so forth? So thank you all so much.
Well, thank you for your question. As far as I know at the moment, there were no prisoners working for medical care or as doctors, but there was one doctor located in Ziegenhain, like in the village, and he was responsible for the prisoners. So he came to Ziegenhain, I think, for one time per week and was like there to answer questions, to help the women and to put them on sick leave if this was needed. But right now, I don't know of any prisoners who were working in medical care.
I'll just answer the question. The change in the treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses actually comes from the top. It's coming from Himmler, who begins to see them as useful for these other purposes. So they're not, they were not, I haven't seen any references to Mitvärde. Their activities seem to be very confined to the main camp and also this estate and other places like that outside of the camp where they're able to, they've been kind of loaned out as trusted and reliable prisoners. Yeah, they're willing to do domestic work as opposed to some of the other kinds of forced labor. I mean, there's really kind of extraordinary stories in some cases, they having had their own children taken away from them because they were unreliable. They're taking care of these children of SS officers, and when the camp is liberated, some of them stay and take care of those children because they feel this commitment. It's kind of boggles my mind, but there are some examples of that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question to that? So where were they? Did they have any role in the negotiations for the liberation? I mean, you mentioned Felix Kirsten. No, there was nothing. They were
No.
Okay. Thank you.
They're apolitical.
Yeah.
And that's part of the theology. So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
A suggestion for Dr. Czerny about reconstructing the lives of this woman without witnesses. I suggest also the internet website, I think is Family Gen or Gen Family for the genealogy, because in this website they are searching a lot of historically documents from the families. I don't know if Poland is the same of Italy, but for example, for the pictures, they are the possibility in Italy to go in the archives of the municipality to take the copies of the identity card made in the time to bring some photos. And I don't know if it's in Poland the same or not.
Thank you for your suggestion, but Julie Jen ordered me an article about my work because they don't have any source about Belarus, about Brest-Litovsk, so they are waiting for my work. Thank you.
I also have question. It's a question to Boris. 2 years ago here, I was speaking about Sorekahan or Sarah Kagan, who was born in Maksimovici, and she was connected with Bobruisk and Minsk, and she died in the Minsk ghetto. And so from her story, I know how hard it is to find any text written by Jewish women from that region. So I found, well, she published as a Jewish writer before World War II, but and I know that Brest was in a different situation, but still I would like to ask you, have you found any text written by Jewish women in Polish? Sore Kahan wrote in Yiddish, of course. Have you found any text written before World War II? Any?
Klum, nothing. Nothing. We have a lot of archives documents, but we don't. I couldn't find any testimony, any diary. Nothing. I have been working for 4 years, and in the Dachaubuch there is some documents, but it's only few.
Okay, thanks to all 3 speakers. It was very interesting and very enriching, and I learned a lot. I have a question for Eileen, and I was wondering how the international Jehovah's Witnesses community respond to the persecution in Germany, and if there were any diplomatic or relief efforts from abroad.
Well, the efforts are in terms of getting literature to them. It's really focused on the proselytization. So there's not like a relief effort type thing to get them out. Frankly, if I had a pass to go in and out, I wouldn't be coming back in. But they have these passes in which they can go and get things for the children or whatever, and they come back. I mean, they're completely trustworthy in that way. So the efforts from Jehovah's Witnesses elsewhere in the world are to get publications to them because they see this as this opportunity to proselytize. I mean, it's difficult for me to determine the number of converts that people who convert in the camp, because it's also unclear whether the conversions are for food and they maintain that after or whether, you know, they're real kind of thing, because they're mostly Russian and Ukrainian women that accept this Jehovah's Witness baptism in the camp. But it's unclear how many of those continue to practice afterwards. Because obviously it gave them access to food and support and help and, you know, getting favorable assignments. And, you know, there were certain practical advantages too.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of the three speakers. It was really fascinating. I have a question to Boris. As an historian, I can hardly understand how you managed to work when you had so little sources and testimonies. Can you a little bit explain more about what were your tools?
Yeah. My tools is my desire to build something of my own history. My parents are from there, and I wanted for 5 years ago. I wanted to see where my grandmother lived, and then I found out protocols. I think I could build a wall of memory with humanity numeric. How do you call it? Humanity, electronic humanities, with engineers who could help me to exploit all the data as I found. Then I wanted to give back the identity of each Jew we lived in the ghetto, and then I wanted I made this prosopography of the community, and then I wrote about children, and then about women, and then trying to establish the links which existed between each man and woman in this community. And there will be an exhibition in Yad Vashem, I suppose. It's a thing which is planned. The main difficulty was that there was nothing about this community, about this ghetto before. Almost nothing. Almost nothing. Nobody survived. Nothing.
I have a question to Elaine. The camp was only for Judea, Jehovah?
No. It was just that they were
Jehovah, the witnesses?
The first prisoners to Ravensbrück, the first transport, was almost entirely German, and a high proportion of them were Jehovah's Witnesses. It's certainly not a strictly Jehovah's Witness camp in any sense.
And they had any interaction between the Jewish prisoners and
Well, the Jewish prisoners come in large numbers more toward the end. Ravensbrück initially is not a heavily Jewish camp. It's toward the end that it becomes so. Rochelle Seidel has said that the numbers of Jewish prisoners at Ravensbrück are way underestimated because they're not registered. It becomes very chaotic. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are persecuted very early. Even before the war is beginning.
They saw themselves as or variation of Jews. That's what I understood from what you're saying.
They use this term that they were spiritual Jews. And they have a very heavy Old Testament emphasis. The theology is rather complicated. I've tried to sort some of this out. One of the problems is when the group is founded, there is a particular theology under Russell, and he predicts the kingdom of God is going to come in 1914, and then when it doesn't come and the prophecy kind of falls apart, the group kind of is refounded by Rutherford, and he changes a lot of the theology and kind of ideas in that sort of thing. So that's kind of refounded in 1931.
There was not any solidarity or any
Not really.
interaction between the groups.
Not really.
Thanks.
I mean, they're kept separately for the most part. So, yeah.
Sorry, but still we have testimonies by Jehovah Witnesses telling about the faith of the Jews. So
Yeah.
when the Jews could not testify because they
Yeah.
went to the gas chamber, at least
Yeah.
in Auschwitz, but they can tell, Jehovah Witnesses could tell about the Jews' faith,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
I know a lot of
Yeah.
testimonies.
Yeah. There's,
So there was some interaction.
there is, you know, I was
Since they
looking-
were fairly free, as
Yes.
you described,
Yes.
they could see what's happening
Yes.
around them.
Yes. Yes,
were
they
very
are.
good
They are
witnesses,
witnesses in
very
lots
good
of ways.
witnesses.
Yes. Yes.
If I add, I wanted to say that I found the registration books of the population by the Soviet administration in '39, and by comparing the population in '39 and in '41, thanks to digital humanities, I will soon be able to establish the name of the Jewish men who were killed in the July '41 and why they've been killed, the professions, the profile.
Yeah, thank you to all of you for another round of interesting presentations. I have a question addressed to Michelle. In which way did this, what you presented to us, differ under the Nazi regime to the incarceration practices in the late 19th century, for example? So what was specific about the Nazi regime and the Zuchthaus? And then Boris, did you come across the prison in Brest-Litovsk? Because a lot of Sinti and Roma from East Prussia were imprisoned there before being deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
I thank you for your question. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. You wanted to know the specifics of a Zuchthaus, or
what you presented, because the material that you worked with, from what I saw, it's you have Justizakten, Strafvollzugsakten of files that were kept by judicial kind of incarceration facilities, maybe a Zuchthaus or prison or so, and these were already they existed in the 19th century already on individual prisoners, and there was a prison practice and a reform of prisons in the 19th century, where they also discussed the role of work. So a lot of the material that you presented could be found in such prison files from the late 19th century also. So I'm wondering what, if you just compare it and highlight what was specific about such a Zuchthaus with a long tradition of incarceration, what was specific under the Nazi regime?
Ah, okay, I see. Well, I'm not as, I don't have a lot of knowledge of prisons or Zuchthaus in the 19th century, but I would say that mainly the difference is that they had to work like a lot more than they had to do before, because the initial idea of Zuchthaus, of course, were like to re-educate prisoners, but this idea was like getting totally lost in the National Socialist era. They were just like the Nazis tried to exploit the prisoners as much as possible. And I would also say that, like, if you compare them to the other accommodations, like Festungshaft or something like this, they were just like harder in the daily life. The conditions were worse, and I think that they also worsened in comparison to the 19th century.
Thank you for your question. After the extermination of the Jewish population in Brest, the ghetto became a lager camp for Sinti and Roma, 3 months. And then they have been exterminated, they have been deported to Auschwitz. Yeah. There were a few. I don't know a lot about this topic, but I only know that the ghetto became a camp. In the report of the Nazi administration, one can read that no, the place is empty. We can gather Roma. There are a place for Roma and Sinti.
About gypsies in Brest-Litovsk, Alexander Ramati reconstructed their history of the gypsies passed by Brest-Litovsk in his book and after in his movie And the Violence Stopped Playing. There were a group engaged by the Nazis to go, but in the romance is reconstructed that they were go to the ghetto where the Jews were before them and after transferred by treatment to the extermination camps.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the information. But if I may, I have 30,000 documents about Jewish population. It's enough.
Okay.
Okay, if we don't have more questions, I would like to thank our lecturers and yeah, thank you. And also thank you for your questions. And I would like to conclude this panel and thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.